answered a phone call, only to hear the person you were just thinking of on the other side? Ever had a dream about something that later actually happened? Ever felt that somebody was reading your mind? Some people may interpret these sorts of experiences as extrasensory perception or ESP. But what is it? Is it pseudoscience? Are mediums truly receiving messages from the deceased? Is the hereafter trying to get in touch with the living? Could it be that we are experiencing an odd form of neuroplasticity after experiencing a traumatic event? Or are these psychic abilities nothing more than a primordial information that is stored in the human cells and released after encountering the right triggers? Welcome, or welcome back to the Next Truth podcasts. Let's ask questions. ESP, also known as the sixth sense, a term adopted by Duke University psychologist J.B. Rhine in the 1930s to denote psychic abilities, is still an unproven paranormal phenomenon in which people allegedly receive information about or exert control over their environment in ways that don't use the recognized physical senses. Skills that refer to a wide range of abilities, including telepathy, psychokinesis, and precognition, which are violating our understanding of the basic scientific principles. Still, according to a 2019 study published in Europe's Journal of Psychology, estimates suggest that around two-thirds of people in the United States alone believe in its existence. But how real is it? I am your host, Marianne van Driel, and today I'm speaking with the head of the University of London's Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit, British psychologist Chris French, who specializes in psychology of paranormal beliefs and experiences, cognition and emotion, and discuss with him the reality of an unseen world, also known as ESP. Professor French, welcome to the Next Truth podcast. Let's ask questions. But before we are going to make an awe-inspiring voyage through the brain, zigzag along a zillion of neurons, and discover how we gain and use ESP, can you tell us who is Professor French?
Yes, I am emeritus professor of psychology. I retired from Goldsmiths, University of London, over a year ago now. And while I was there, amongst other things, I was head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. And anomalistic psychology is, in a nutshell, the psychology of kind of weird experiences and beliefs and so on, and tends to have a fairly skeptical approach. I used to, for much of my life, well into early adulthood, I was a believer in many, many paranormal phenomena, but I have become very, very skeptical, and I'd now say that, in fact, pretty much on most paranormal topics, I would tend to go for the more skeptical explanations.
You say that you had your own paranormal encounters or experiences, but become a skeptic. What made you become a skeptic?
Well, first off, I wouldn't say that I'd actually had any kind of experiences that certainly I would describe now as being paranormal. I think many people have kind of strange experiences at various points, which they think, you know, may or may not be paranormal. The thing that turned me into a skeptic, and I've talked about this many times, was reading one particular book that had been recommended to me by a friend. This was when I was doing my PhD at Leicester University. My PhD was nothing to do with this kind of stuff. It was nothing to do with anomalistic psychology. It was all about brain function, cerebral hemispheres, and using EEG, and it was all very scientific and technical. And someone recommended a book called Parapsychology, Science or Magic by James Alcock. Just basically thinking, I think you'd enjoy this, which indeed I did. And it was the first kind of skeptical treatment of the paranormal that I'd ever come across, and putting forward alternative non-paranormal explanations, which generally I found pretty convincing. I also found the book really interesting and fascinating. Long story short, that kind of opened up the world of skepticism to me. And I realized that there were skeptical books out there. There were publications like the Skeptical Inquirer and so on, which up until that point I'd never heard of. And I got really into it, mainly at that point, really as a hobby, as a kind of side interest. It wasn't something that I'd intended to incorporate into my academic career. But then very slowly I did begin to do that. Initially, when I started at Goldsmiths in 1985, and I did a couple of lectures. At this point, from a skeptical perspective on the paranormal. The students seemed to enjoy them, and I certainly enjoyed giving them. And then about 10 years later, I realized that I kind of knew enough about this stuff that I could put on a whole course as part of our degree program. And again, that was very popular, and I enjoyed teaching it, and the students seemed to enjoy listening to it. Whether they were believers or skeptics, it's the kind of thing that people like to talk about and to discuss, you know. And I was gradually just kind of doing the odd little publication here and there. And eventually I kind of realized I was actually pretty much explicitly told by one head of department at that time that they didn't really encourage me in this line of research. They tolerated it. But as long as I kind of carried on doing more academically respectable stuff as well. But eventually it got to a point where I realized that this was the stuff that I really found fascinating and interesting. And also, I have to say, it was what I was known for. If I was known for anything, it was for doing this kind of stuff rather than the more respectable research where I was a small fish in a big ocean. In terms of this very specialized area, I was a relatively large fish in a small pond, you know. And so eventually I just kind of I devoted myself just purely to this kind of stuff. And I also think the attitude within academia has changed. The old-fashioned ideas are still there to some extent, but it's changed a lot. But when I first started getting into this stuff, as I say, I was pretty much discouraged from doing it. People thought, you know, what's the point? What are you interested in that stuff for? And now I think people do actually accept that, you know, this is an interesting and important thing. It's part of the human condition, whether the paranormal is real or not. Most people do believe in some aspect of the paranormal, and many people claim to have had a personal experience. So either way, whether it's real or not, it's worth studying as part of human psychology.
So this book is what influenced you to dive into the reality or non-reality of paranormal events or experiences.
Well, that's initially it encouraged me to kind of how shall I put it? To go for a paddle in the shallow end, and then gradually it got deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yes.
And as I say, now this is my sole kind of area of interest. But it was a fairly gradual process.
Yes, there is the paranormal or the paranormal world or the experience that people have. There is a lot of ground to cover. So, but how do you or do you specifically research or conduct your research to find out whether somebody is a true medium or is truly receiving messages from the afterlife. How do you conduct your research, and how does that differ from other research, from other parapsychologists? Or
Well, I mean, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I'd really kind of just say that, you know, there are two strands to the research that my unit has done over the years. The major strand has certainly been in terms of starting off from a working hypothesis of saying, well, let's assume that paranormal phenomena don't exist. Can we explain the beliefs that people have, the strange experiences that people have in non-paranormal terms? And then basically kind of trying to set up ways to test those explanations wherever we can. I can talk more about that in a while, but the other strand of what we do is really, for want of a better phrase, mainstream parapsychology. We are directly testing paranormal claims. Now, when it comes to that side of things, the way that you go about testing it just depends entirely upon what the actual claim is. So to give you a couple of specific examples, we have done tests on mediums and psychics who claim that they can tell complete strangers things about them, you know, having never met them before or spoken to them, doing any background research. Well, that's something which is testable. So typically what we might do in a test like that is to invite the psychic or medium in. We'd get a few volunteers to come along and have readings done. We'd have to take certain precautions because obviously you can tell a lot about someone from looking at them. You can certainly tell a lot about someone from their accent, etc., etc. So we might, for example, have the medium or the psychic, depending on how they describe themselves, do their readings with each sitter behind the screen. They don't talk to them. They just write down their psychically received impressions. And then at the end of the day, we'd get all of our volunteer sitters to come back. We would give them a booklet with all the readings in, and they don't know which reading has been done for them. But if the psychics can really do what they say they can do, then there ought to be one reading that stands out as having lots of specific, accurate detail about that person's life. Well, we're doing kind of several tests along those lines, and to date, we haven't found anybody who actually was able to do it. Now, we make sure before we start those tests that the person, that the claimant, is happy with the tests. They agree it is a fair test before we begin. Typically, what happens when they fail the test is they then decide it wasn't a fair test for reasons X, Y, and Z. But as I say, we go out of our way to try to accommodate. You know, there's no point in testing someone if they say in advance, well, no, I can't, either I can't do that or I can't do that under the conditions that you want to test me. Well, what's the point? You may as well all go home and do something else. But we've carried out lots of tests along those lines. We've also done tests of dowsers, and again, it depends. In the case of the dowsers, we had a very simple test. Basically, could the dowsers distinguish between a bottle of water and a bottle of sand?
I saw that. I saw that YouTube video. That kind of research that I've seen from you. Yes.
On the Richard Dawkins series, Enemies of Reason. Yeah. And again, you know, we test in advance. Some dowsers would say, well, no, I can't do that. I can only detect flowing water. So, well, fine, don't do the test. You know, all of our dowsers said yes, they'd be able to do that, and then, as it turned out, they couldn't. We've done tests of people who claim that their dreams foretell the future. We've done a couple of tests along those lines, but again, we would design the test in collaboration with the claimant and make sure the claimant is happy that this is a fair test of their claims, and then we go ahead and run the test. We will do whatever we can to accommodate any requests from the claimant, provided they don't compromise experimental control. If we can do it and it's reasonably easy to do, we will do it.
Do you see during your research conducting and these experiments, do you see a particular type of people coming towards you and say, okay, this is what I can do, this is what I have been doing for, well, 10 years, just saying something. Is there a particular type of people that is?
Well, I mean, there are some common characteristics, but there's also a lot of variability. I mean, clearly, anybody who believes that they themselves have psychic ability is likely to believe in a whole range of other kind of paranormal and new age type ideas.
Yeah.
But you know, they may be male, female, various different ages. You know, have lots of other different interests. Some of them absolutely hate skeptics. Some of them are quite friendly. I mean, I always try my best to try and get on with the person that I'm dealing with anyway. So you get a kind of wide range in terms of that. I mean, informally, I've obviously done kind of lots of daytime TV and that kind of stuff over the years. I took part in a couple of series of a program about paranormal investigation of haunted homes and so on. So again, informally, you can also kind of get quite an insight into the way things are working, you know, but obviously very different to any kind of formal experiment where you have very tight control over the conditions and you say what would count as a positive significant result and what wouldn't and so on in advance. But yeah, so in terms of the kind of taking it as a whole, there's a very wide range.
Well, the reason why I'm asking for this is when you look at science or scientists trying to unravel the mysteries of the unexplained, most of the times there is a money reward against it, or some kind of material reward for people to gain when they apply to the experiment or to the research. So in my opinion, it is most likely that you always gather or address the same kind of people who have an interest in gaining something from that. And those who really have the skills keep quiet because they do not want to engage or be on the same or in the same spots or put into the same jar as people who are only going for the money prize, if I may say it or call it like so.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, James Randi famously had $1 million on offer for anybody who could demonstrate.
Yeah, I heard something like that. Well, I read about something like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, again, I mean, interestingly, kind of when I kind of first became a skeptic, when I first read that book by James Alcott, there was lots of mentions of this guy called James Randi, who, again, up until then I'd never heard of. Kind of over the years, I actually got to know Randi very well to the extent that, you know, he's now passed away, but I thought of him as being kind of a personal friend. And also James Alcott, the guy who wrote the book, which is kind of quite nice from my point of view, that I could turn around in later life and say it's your fault that I'm into that. This is where I've ended up. But Randi's $1 million challenge, it was then kind of taken over by the James Randi Educational Foundation. But the idea was that before going for the formal $1 million test, claimants would have to, in general, would have to pass a test carried out by somebody that Randi knew and trusted. If they passed that test, then they could go for the $1 million. And of course, that meant that we ended up kind of carrying out quite a number of those preliminary tests. And of course, everybody always failed them, so that Randi and JREF didn't actually have to do any testing. But it was a kind of an interesting process. And a lot of the time, you know, people will say, you know, well, I don't want to go. I'm not interested in money. I don't want to go for that. And my reply would be, well, fine, you don't have to take the money, or you could take the $1 million and give it to charity. There's a huge number of good causes out there. But I kind of think, I mean, in some ways, obviously, the prizes that were on offer are a kind of rhetorical device, so that on daytime TV, you could actually say to people, look, if you can really do this, there's $1 million waiting for you, just go for it, you know. But quite a number of people just want to, you know, I'm sure they're sincere in their claims. I mean, they wouldn't put themselves forward for testing under the conditions that we know, that they know we will test them under. I'm not saying that we, had such a great knowledge of, things like conjuring, so on, that we could never be fooled. But if we are setting up the test, then even somebody who is a brilliant conjurer would find, would struggle to pass it, because we're in control of all the conditions. I think that almost certainly the people that we've tested them at the time that they were tested sincerely believed in what they were doing, and in many cases they genuinely weren't that interested in the money. They just wanted to prove to the world that they really did have what they felt was this amazing ability. Sometimes it's quite it's quite upsetting to go through this whole process. I mean, I remember particularly with the dowsers, for example, that one or two of them were really, really upset after the test, because they were convinced.
With the test, or with themselves, or the results, or? Well,
I mean, I'll give you one specific example that sticks in my mind. There's a lovely guy, he actually appears in the clip that's on the YouTube, Jim Negus, who his explanation of how he was able to dowse was that it was God. God would tell him the answer.
Okay.
And on the day, of course, he failed our test. And Richard Dawkins asks him, well, what happened? Why weren't you able to pass the test? And he says, well, it's just God having a joke with me. He's like that, But then about a month later, bless him, he turned up at my office at Goldsmiths with another test that he had designed. And although it was a kind of, I won't go into details, I can't remember them, but it was a weird kind of setup. But basically, had he been able to pass this test that he had designed for himself to do in my office, it would have demonstrated his claim, And he went and tried to do it, and he failed again. And the poor guy was almost in tears. He couldn't understand why, in his mind, why is God doing this to him? He'd tried it before he came out to see me, and it worked. And he'd come to my office, and it had failed again, And he was very, very upset. Yes. And you feel kind of, well, I'm sorry if I'm happy for you to carry on believing that. My general attitude is you can believe whatever you like as long as it doesn't hurt other people. That's my general philosophy on life. Yes. But I will tell you whether or not I believe in X, Y, and Z, and if I don't believe in them, why I don't believe in them. But as I say, beyond that, and I've no particular wish to take someone's beliefs away if they find them psychologically helpful in any way. But at the end of the day, for the science is all about, well, what's true, not what makes us feel good. So, yeah.
So what is the scientific criteria for saying that somebody is a true medium, that somebody is possessing true skills?
Well, again, would they be able to pass the kind of tests that we put them through?
Yes.
If they can do that, then that would be amazing. And,
so what are the rules?
Well, we would set the rules in advance. So, for example, if we were doing a test of some psychic claimant, somebody who says that they can tell complete strangers all about them, about them without ever having met them before, we'd say, fine, well, we'll bring a number of volunteers in. Like one of the first tests that we did, which I did in collaboration with Professor Richard Wiseman, we had 10 volunteers, and we said that if our claimant, if when we got the sitters to come back and go through these booklets, if 5 or more of them could pick out the reading that had been done for them, that would be passing the test. Now that would basically be the first stage, in terms of, I'm not saying that I would then automatically say, oh, right, well, that proves that, you really do have ESP. I would say, well, that's really interesting. I think, something is probably going on there. There are other possibilities. It might have been, it was just a statistical fluke, and that every time we tried to test afterwards, it was never repeated, in which case, well, it might be that this person was a very, very clever fraud. So we'd want to maybe have a think about, were there any things that we needed to tighten up on? But at the end of the day, if they can do that reliably and it would replicate, then I hope that we'd get to a point where I and other fair-minded scientists would say, this is really interesting, there's something going on here. It's at that point that we then try and dig deeper to explain what's going on. is it something in the brain? Is it, what is the explanation? But, before trying to come up with explanations, I would always want to make sure there is something there to be explained first. And over the years, in the various tests of paranormal claimants that we've done, that just hasn't happened.
Well, I was thinking when asking this question, what the criteria is for instance, my dog, that's a personal story. My dog died, one of my dogs died in 2020, and I was really devastated by that. So for about, I think it was 4 or 5 days, I was absolutely in shock, didn't feel anything. Okay, the grieving process. And then at one point, I received a particular feeling that I understood was not mine, but it was so overwhelming, but in a positive sense. So I listened to that feeling. I contacted the person in that I thought it was coming from, and it was coming from miles and miles away. And this person acknowledged and said, okay, yes, that was mine. I was sending that. So I think personally that there are people in the world who really can do these things, and really, like me, receiving particular emotions and thoughts and images from people, also when it is remote. But nobody who is really doing this says, okay, you know what, I'm going with my face on national TV and I'm going to tell the world what and explain this and being on the fire, etc. No, these people say, okay, I know that I can do this. I do not need the attention for that. And in that way, science will never find an answer to if paranormal experiences are real and how they work. But that's my personal idea. Something else you constantly say, or constantly, you mentioned a couple of times that you are a skeptic. What, according to you, is skepticism?
It's basically someone who says, show me the evidence, convince me. That's it. I mean, it's that's it in a kind of the ideal sense. It's not making your mind up in advance before you've looked at the evidence. It's trying to assess things as fairly as possible. Now, having said that, one of the kind of themes that runs throughout anomalistic psychology is the fact that we all have these various cognitive biases. Anybody who says, oh, no, I'm entirely neutral, well, they're fooling themselves. It's a very, very naive thing to say. But we can try our best to do that. And I think science is the best tool to do that. Because when we design these tests, we do it in such a way that hopefully any biases on either side are ruled out, they're eliminated. We'll use double-blind methodology and so on and so forth. So, until we actually get the results in at the end and then have a look at them, there's no chance of any kind of bias creeping in. Now, I mean, going back to what you said before, if it is the case that there are some people who do have amazing abilities and can do all this stuff, but basically have no interest whatsoever in ever demonstrating. It's not a matter of whether they want to go on TV or be in the media. If they don't want to actually kind of prove it scientifically, well, that means yes, science will never be aware of them. It's as simple as that. So they may be there, but unless they're actually willing to come forward, I mean, if you, even just to satisfy yourself and your friend, if you could work out a test that you could do between you and see, whether or not you got results that supported what you think might be going on, it's up to you. If you don't want to bother, that's fine. But I mean, again, from a scientific point of view, if people are not willing to actually put themselves to a kind of scientifically controlled test, well, yeah, you're right. Science will never know about them. So science might be missing out on some genuine phenomena. But I mean, again, there's not much we can do about that.
Well, maybe trying to experiment or in a non-controlled situation and out of the box thinking, perhaps that is a thing, or saying, okay, let's see what's happening, but we are not going to publish it. Maybe that is something, but I personally think these people will never come forward. I was also thinking, could it be, and now I'm skipping very, very fast from topic, could it be that particular experiences by a large group of people are being triggered after, or being developed after a traumatic event? That it is a kind of neuroplasticity, trying to figure out or fitting into a system that is not completely the same as before the traumatic event. Is that a possibility?
Well, again, I mean, as I say, you're talking to someone who is not convinced that ESP exists. So
okay.
It's that thing of kind of saying, well, as I said before, I generally don't try to come up with explanations for things that until those things have actually been demonstrated to exist. But I mean, in terms of, there is some interesting research with respect to paranormal belief and the tendency to report paranormal experiences and trauma. One reliable finding in the literature is that people who report having had some kind of traumatic childhood are more likely to believe in the paranormal and to report having paranormal experiences. And that the nature of that trauma can either be something like, say, a long period of childhood illness, or it might be various forms of abuse, emotional, sexual, physical. Now, one theory that has been put forward to explain that is that we also know that personality characteristics like fantasy proneness and the tendency to dissociate are also associated with reports of a traumatic childhood. And there's a parapsychologist called Harvey Irwin who has put forward the notion that what's happening here, perhaps, is that those kids who are going through those awful childhoods are becoming fantasy prone as a way of escaping psychologically from the harsh reality. They can go into this fantasy world where they do have some sense of control, etc., etc. But then they grow up to be people who would, they're making big generalizations here, but this is the kind of general shape of the idea. There'd be people who'd be more likely to experience hallucinations occasionally, to have false memories, etc., etc. So from a kind of skeptical perspective, that makes sense to me. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe some of these experiences that people are having are based on those kinds of factors like hallucinations, false memories, and so on and so forth. Or it may be that those people, from a believer's perspective, that those are people who now have the right kind of psychological profile to experience genuinely paranormal phenomena, if indeed they exist. So you can kind of look at it from either side, but there is evidence, just to go back to what you were saying, of some kind of link between trauma, certainly, and particularly childhood trauma, and the tendency to report paranormal experiences. But again, in terms, there are a number of possible different explanations. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. What you are saying is ESP is not real. It is most likely a form of escape created by the brain itself after whatever it is that somebody has experienced.
Possibly.
Am I correct?
Possibly, yeah. And again, I wouldn't go for one single, whether ESP is real or not. We certainly know that there are situations where people may feel they've experienced ESP that definitely do not involve anything paranormal. We know that. I think everybody would accept that. Whether there are also some experiences that genuinely are paranormal in the sense that they could not be explained in terms of conventional science is, I think, still open to question. I'm happy for parapsychologists and others to try and produce evidence that they say supports the idea that these things are real. What I think that the scientific parapsychologists have not yet managed to achieve is some kind of reliable robust, replicable demonstration of any of these effects. And that's after, well over a century of research now. And I think that's kind of quite important. There's no single phenomenon within parapsychology that we could set to a first year lab class as a lab exercise and have any hope that they would actually get significant positive results. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's just around the next corner. It could always be just around the next corner, but it's not there yet. So I was to say, I am, I'm even, I'm still collaborating with a parapsychologist who is a complete believer in terms of doing a study that, could go one way, it could go the other way. We will see. But so I'm, I've tried. It does annoy me sometimes when people, would say, "Oh, you're just a closed-minded skeptic," because I put more hours into testing paranormal claims than any of those people have, and I've really put a lot of effort into it. So it's not.
Oh no, absolutely. I do not doubt you in any way. So, but it is every now and then I like to play the devil's advocate and putting some fire on the shoelaces of people.
That is something which I think is kind of what does it really mean to be open-minded? It means to me that you could say, well, this is what would convince me I'm wrong. Yeah. Now I can do that for most of these phenomena. I can tell you what would convince me that the SP is real, what would convince me precognition is real, and so on and so forth. Whereas most of these people who are kind of on the other side criticizing would say, well, no, I just know I'm right. I know I'm right. There's nothing that could convince me I'm wrong. I know I am. Well, no, that's not scientific.
I wonder, can you explain this phenomena of crisis apparition?
It's an interesting one. It's the kind of thing that keeps me kind of intrigued and interested. It's something that is kind of reported, relatively often. But what we'd need is some kind of baseline information regarding how many times do people kind of have something that some kind of what they feel is a premonition, and then it doesn't happen, because of course you tend not to remember that. It's only what it does. I mean, I remember, my mother. This is just anecdotal evidence, so it doesn't really count for much. But just as an illustration, calling me up saying that she'd been really worried, she felt something wrong. And no, everything was fine. I can remember. I mean, you asked me before about whether I'd had any weird experiences. I can remember. This would be what? This is the first job I got after getting my degree. I was working as a research assistant, and I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a figure at the foot of the bed. It was my girlfriend at the time. I was in North Wales, in Bangor in North Wales. She was in Leicester at the university. She was a medical student at the University of Leicester. And I kind of did a double take and disappeared. I admit I had been out drinking the night before with friends.
Oh, okay. Well, there's your solution.
But even so, I still kind of rang her up and said, were you okay last night? You weren't ill or anything, were you? And no, she hadn't been. But if she had been, I may well have kind of been convinced, oh, wow, some kind of spooky psychic link between us. So it's difficult to say. It is difficult to say. One of the kind of things that, again, runs through anomalistic psychology is the fact that with all this kind of anecdotal evidence, you are dealing with someone's report of what happened, not the actual event itself. So it raises the whole question of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. And we know from mountains of psychological research that eyewitness testimony can be extremely unreliable. The very first systematic study of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony was carried out in the context of a fake seance. This was back in the Victorian era.
Yeah.
And basically, what we had there was a guy called S.J. Davy, who had been to seances and was initially convinced by what he saw. Then he heard that all these effects could be achieved by trickery, so he practiced the tricks himself, set up his own seance, and got people to write down afterwards as accurately as they possibly could everything that they had seen. and the accounts they gave were so far from what had happened in terms of the sequence of events, who was in the room when things, what happened, and so on, that it would have been impossible to give a non-paranormal explanation. The problem was the accounts, although sincere, were inaccurate. And so there's all those kind of factors that come in as well. That's why, at the end of the day, I will probably never really be convinced by anecdotal evidence, including crisis apparitions. I would potentially be convinced by data coming from well-controlled studies. And maybe that's a mistake, but that's, yeah, that's I think one of the differences between kind of believers and skeptics can be that it's just a matter of where you set your criteria to decide that something is true. If the evidence has to be really, really, really strong before you'll accept something as being true, you run the risk that you'll actually reject some things that are true because the available evidence doesn't seem to meet your criteria. But you know, you'll make sure that pretty much everything that you do believe probably is true. The other way around, if you set your criteria lower, you'll kind of make sure that you catch more of the things that really are true, but you'll also accept some things that aren't. And nobody can tell you, you know, nobody can give you the God-given point that you should set your criterion.
Well, crisis apparitions, I think science should think about or consider to apply these stories or anecdotes or experiences as well as scientific in the scientific research, and also treat it like that. I myself, for instance, have experienced several of them, all in different kinds of situations, but the only thing that was constantly the same was I was at home alone. And one of them was, for instance, a very one that stood really out was I was home alone in the evening. I have told this story several times, and I was watching TV, a dull detective series that it was, and suddenly a loud bang in front of me. So that was my cell phone at that moment. That was, the screen had shattered into pieces. A few minutes later, I felt that there was an energy building up next to me. And suddenly I felt, and I almost could see it, that was a young man rising in dark clothing, Caucasian skin color, and a little bit of long hair just above the shoulders. And his head was hanging like this. And that was the only thing that he was doing. He was standing next to me like this. And I was going like, oh my God, what the heck is happening? And I was constantly focused on this moment, that moment of jump scares. But that didn't came. And it faded away. It took a couple of minutes before it started to fade away, this energy. And it was really, really dense. And when it was away, I quickly called my ex-husband and said, oh my God, because he was in another country. And I was going, oh my God, this is what's happening. This is what happened. And a few days later, two women rang my front doorbell. And one of the women was the mother of the young man that was standing next to me. He had committed suicide by hanging himself. How in the bleep is it possible that I see something, an energy of a young man that I do not know, never seen, never spoken, and that these two women several days later come to my door and do their story? Mother was completely shattered, of course, obviously. So how is that possible, that a crisis apparition that is absolutely not related to me in any way starting to happen? And there were three people, my ex-husband, the woman, the friend, the woman friend, and the mother. All were evidence to say so, witness of what I have witnessed. How is it possible? And how do you, Professor French, can explain something like that from a scientific point of view?
I mean, obviously, you know, one possibility, I mean, it's very unusual for a crisis apparition to occur when you don't actually have an emotional link with the person who's having the crisis. But
sure, yeah.
I mean, there's a whole range, there's a lot of variability in those kinds of experiences. I can come up with a possible explanation, but, you know, admittedly, I don't know whether it's the right explanation or not. Now, I mean, one of the things I'm very, very interested in is the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, which you probably heard of.
I was absolutely awake. I was not paralyzed. I was awake, absolutely not asleep.
A boring detective program.
Okay, fine. Okay, you cut me to shit.
Half drifted off, or you're beginning to drift off, and I mean, again, interestingly, I mean, because people know that I'm interested in sleep paralysis, I get sent lots and lots of first-hand accounts, and even though the people that are sending me those accounts, typically they are aware, they themselves have decided, oh, it's this thing called sleep paralysis. They're not necessarily saying it's a paranormal phenomenon.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. I had only once in my life sleep paralysis, and I can assure you it was absolutely not sleep paralysis in any way, really in any way. But okay, I am open-minded. I will listen to your explanation. Let's assume it was sleep paralysis in some kind of way.
It's, I mean, again, that thing of seeing someone, a hanged man, I can give you, you know, I've had several people who've reported seeing that. It's a kind of common bit of imagery that can occur. I mean, relatively common. You know, I mean, there's such a wide range of things, but certain themes crop up repeatedly, and certainly several people have kind of reported that. So that's what came to my mind when you said it. Now, obviously, you've not only got that, which would be a shocking and scary experience in itself, but then someone knocking on your door and saying that, you know, their son had actually committed suicide by hanging. Now, again, I don't know how similar the image, the vision that you saw was to the actual physical appearance of the son.
Exactly. I mean, it was exactly the same person I saw, and that the mother described, made a description of her son. It was the same person.
Is she a photograph, or did you have?
No, I didn't saw a photograph. I listened to her description. So yeah, okay. Perhaps there's a foggy fake.
I know that memory is influenced by, you know, if you you often remember seeing what you think you must have seen rather than necessarily what you did actually see. And again, this is, you know,
yes.
I mean, now I've said that's I've just kind of pulled that explanation out of the air. It may or may not be anywhere near the truth of what happened, but all I'm saying is there are alternatives, and so, you know, the fact is that a good paranormal story, you know, one that we find kind of compelling and interesting, like the one you've just given, is one where you do have, you know, these different factors that are going to be. If there's an obvious possible counter explanation, well, you probably wouldn't even bother telling people about it. You know, you kind of just write it off yourself. But it will sometimes happen that you'll get this very kind of unlikely conjunction of events that end up with a kind of really good compelling story that a believer would find totally convincing and compelling, and maybe they're right. Maybe, you know, maybe it was a genuine paranormal phenomenon. But there are also alternative non-paranormal explanations, even in cases like that.
I haven't thought about it like that.
I don't know. I'm not claiming that I've got the definitive kind of.
No, but I haven't thought about it like that. So that is a new light that is shining on the event. So I will let my mind run over that tonight and see if I can merge what you are saying and what I have experienced, if there is another explanation in that. Like I said, I'm open-minded and I'm willing to explore my own experiences. Why do you think that these things happen? And why do you think that people experience crisis apparitions? Could it be that it is a primordial skill that we still have somewhere that's laying dormant in our body, in our cells, that is coming from the period that we were still Neanderthals? Because let's be honest, it would be a very advanced skill to transmit information about dangerous situations and not becoming a human slurpee for a primordial ancient spider or something like that. It would come in handy, right?
In handy. I mean, and people have considered these kinds of issues from an evolutionary perspective. I had a PhD student who was a complete believer, certainly at the beginning of his PhD, and he was very much taking the approach, well, maybe this is some kind of skill that we used to have, or maybe even lower down the evolutionary chain. But one argument there would be, well, why don't we still have it? Because usually useful things that evolve are useful, we keep, and if anything, they get stronger. One explanation that has been put forward to kind of explain that is that maybe it is something that we had before we actually developed more advanced senses rather, and basically, once we had those senses, we didn't really need the kind of
you mean something like the internet being the extension of our nervous system, for instance?
I mean, literally, the argument here, I'm not saying I subscribe to this argument, I'm just saying, it's an interesting one to consider. Why, if we used to have these abilities, do we no longer have them? And if anything, in evolutionary terms, you might expect them to become even more exaggerated and stronger. And one explanation that's been put forward is that we had them really, really early on in evolution, not kind of Stone Age man or anything like that. Unicellular organisms, and maybe they were useful. They gave the edge in terms of survival to those unicellular organisms. But once we developed things like eyes and ears, and the five main senses, but all the other senses as well, they really didn't give us that much of an advantage anymore. So they just disappeared. It's possible. I mean, some people argue that children maybe have more ESP, and again, it's kind of something that they grow out of, so to speak, or we educate out of them, whichever way you want to look at it. But really, when you actually look at the available evidence, at least from the well-controlled studies, then there's not really a great deal of evidence to support those kinds of ideas. And as I say, I'd probably just go back to the kind of notion that if we had these abilities, which would be useful if we had them, there's no denying it, then why don't we still have them? I mean, I suppose there's also, sometimes people make the argument that, well, if we all really did have really strongly developed ESP, it might not be such a great world. You might not want everybody knowing every thought that's going to be your head.
Well, yeah, it is by privacy then, right?
But yeah. So I don't know. I mean, these are things are interesting to speculate about, but I still keep going back to the same thing. Well, prove that there's something there to be explained before I try and start to explain it. I don't know. I mean, as I say, I'm open to the possibility I might be wrong. I think in that respect, the believers have got a kind of preferable position to the skeptics, because as I said before, from the point of view of anomalistic psychology, I would always say that we start from the working hypothesis, and I always emphasize that's all it is, it's a working hypothesis. Let's assume paranormal forces don't exist. Then how can we explain people's reports of precognition or telepathy or clairvoyance and so on? Can we come up with explanations, and then can we put those explanations to the test? But there is always the possibility that maybe we've just not looked in the right place yet, and we've not developed the right methodologies, and maybe these abilities are real. So you've got the situation where no parapsychologist, no believer would argue that every single claim of something paranormal is genuinely paranormal. And it can come across then, I suppose, going back to this thing about open-minded and closed-minded, that the skeptics are saying there's no such thing as the paranormal. I'm saying that as a working hypothesis. And if we don't have a situation where anybody is actually trying to come up with non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences and events, then we won't find them. It may be that at the end of the day, if we got to a point where parapsychology got to a point where the parapsychologists had come up with a reliable, robust demonstration of a paranormal effect, just one, any will do, then we would have, the anomalistic psychologists would have actually helped them in that by helping them to sort out between what is genuinely paranormal and what just looks like it is but it isn't. Now maybe none of it is. You know, that's, if you want my personal opinion, that is what I think. But my personal opinion could be wrong. So we will see. Watch this space.
Do you think that lucid dreams are falling in the realm of the paranormal, or is it more like that we are really stepping outside of our body, physical body, or is it a dream that you remember much better than others? Do you think that lucid dreams fall into the paranormal?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the definition of a lucid dream is simply that it's a dream in which you are aware of the fact that you are dreaming. You know, most of the time when you're dreaming, well, certainly personally, I'm not aware of the fact that I'm dreaming. I'm just, my consciousness is in the dream, whatever the story is that's being told. I actually did have a lucid dream last night, which is probably the first one I've had in many years, and I was quite excited in the dream, thinking, oh, I'm dreaming. Oh, this is great. And normally in the past, when I've had that kind of experience, at that point I have woken up. But this one actually went on for a little bit longer, and I ended up having kind of conversations with people in the dream, and kind of saying to them, "Yeah, oh well, you would say that because you're a product of my imagination." Now, what I said that I am still engaged in a project with a parapsychologist. This is in fact a project with a lucid dreamer. There are 3 of us involved. There's me as a skeptic. There's a parapsychologist who is a firm believer that dreams can foretell the future, at least in certain circumstances. And we have an artist who is a lucid dreamer. And we interested. I won't go into the full details of the methodology, but basically what we do is he will try to have a lucid dream, which is something he's very used to doing. He will, in his dream state, then draw a picture, which he will then kind of recreate when he wakes up, and also give an account of how it happened in the dream, where he was, who he might have been talking to. He says that these pictures that he does, he'll start drawing them and then they just kind of finish themselves off, they're just so. So it's kind of interesting from an artistic perspective as well. That's his USP as an artist. You can commission a picture from him, and he will do a picture that's just for you. That's his way of doing it. But the idea is that he will have his lucid dream, and then the next day I will select a randomly select a target before I know what he's drawn and what his dream was about. I'll select a random target from this big target pool that's used in a lot of parapsychological research, and we'll see whether there are correspondences between what he dreamt about and the target that's been chosen. The target would typically be, you go to a website and there are hundreds of targets potentially there, and there might be something like a web page that will describe, say, some piece of architecture somewhere around the world, or a festival, or a news story. It could be anything, but there'll be verbal description, pictures, maybe video clips, and so on. And we see, is there any correspondence?
Don't you think that there is a danger for the observation problem here?
Carry on.
The observation problem, in the moment that you think about an object or about something, it changes, like the double slit experiment. As soon as that you try to think about looking at the photon, it changes its shape into an electron or anything. And
the person I'm collaborating with
yes,
is not a psychologist, she's a physicist. And she's a total believer in precognitive dreams. So I'll let her worry about that.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, yeah, we'll just see. And interestingly, I mean, she'd already done a pilot test with him before I got involved, and just got results that were just about statistically significant. So that's interesting. Then we did a second pilot study where I was involved, and again we've got marginally significant results. So now we're going to do the proper full study, and we'll see what we find. So watch this space. So yeah.
So be aware then. Perhaps he can see stuff or things about you that you do not want to release into the world at this moment.
Well, my own much more limited lucid dream last night, I
Yes.
actually did think to myself, I wonder if I can make telepathic contact with our lucid dreamer. So, and I was actually get in touch with him to ask him whether he, did you have any dreams that I was in?
Oh, be cautious here. Chris, you also have written a book about the science behind paranormal phenomena, especially ESP, but it has, well, a remarkable title, doesn't it?
It does. It's the title started off as a joke. I mean, basically, what this book is a kind of a popular science version, an introduction to anomalistic psychology. So it's generally from the skeptical perspective. There's no question about that. But I was initially going to call it "Why Weird Stuff Matters," because my kind of thinking there was that very often when people talk about this stuff, it's the kind of stuff that they'll talk about, over dinner or down at the pub, and most people find it interesting, but don't really take it very seriously. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, either paranormal forces really do exist. If that's the case, then that's amazing, and science is missing out on something really important. Or they don't, and can all be explained in terms of the kind of psychological factors that I've mentioned. And again, that's really interesting and important. So either way, it's worth taking seriously. And so that was the kind of my initial thinking was it was going to be why weird stuff matters. But as a joke, I said to a few friends, or I might just call it the science of weird shit. And I said, oh, I'd buy that. I'd buy that. So title we're going with. So that should be out in about a year's time.
Fantastic. Well, the title is hanging in and sticking into people's minds. I can assure you that. But Chris, I see that we have passed the hour. So, is it? Can you tell us where before we close out? Can you tell us where we can find more information about your book and books, your research? And you have many YouTube videos where we can watch you do your research, and if possible, where people can contact you if they have any questions for you to ask.
Okay, I think the best place to go to is my website. It does need updating. I know probably everybody's website needs updating, but it's Prof. Chris French, all one word, profchrisfrench.com. And there's lots more about the various things we've been talking about, and you'll be able to kind of download some papers and so on. And I would think probably on there somewhere, I'm pretty sure, is my email address, which is c.french@gold.ac.uk.
Chris, I'd like to thank you so much for this interesting and amazing interview. And well, there's so much stuff to cover in this field, and I can go on and ask you questions and listen to your explanations. And I am promising that I will run my mind over your explanation about my crisis apparition and see if I can find another explanation for what it was. Professor French, thank you so much, and I wish you a very, very pleasant evening.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed myself. Bye-bye.
I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today on the Next Truth podcast's Let's Ask Questions. Make sure to visit our website. That is www.nexttruth.com. That is nexttruth, all in one word, .com. And let us know what you think about our podcasts. While you're at it, if you find value in this show, we would appreciate a rating on our website in the section Testimonials. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel and share the links on your social media. I am Marianne van Driel with The Next Truth. Let's Ask Questions. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode.